From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I want to welcome you to the Library of Congress. This program is sponsored to you by two illustrious parts of the Library of Congress. In the year 1936, they were both funded by a man by the name of Archer Milton Huntington. Archer Milton Huntington established the Hispanic Division's reading room, which opened in 1939. But in 1936, it also gave money to establish the Poetry and Literature section. You need to know a little bit about the library when you come here, but we're very glad you have come because we bring people in here who you may know about or who you may not know about. We try and bring them in to let people know about the wealth of materials available in Spanish, in English, and in a variety of other languages. Naturally, I prefer the Spanish or the English. But then there's the Portuguese too. What I want to do is give you a couple of words and tell you that this is sponsored by the Hispanic Division, by the Poetry and Literature section, and the Inter-American Development Bank, and all the people who are here, because something like this doesn't happen all the time, and so we're very glad that you're here. This morning, Juan Gabriel Vásquez recorded for the Archive of Hispanic Literature on tape. This is a collection of tapes of over 680, 690 authors who have recorded exclusively for the Library of Congress. You can come to the Hispanic Division to listen to the tapes. We'd like to have you come, and even more, again, we're very glad that you're here. Now, the first thing you want to do is reach in and take out your phones and turn them off, because we're recording this. And if anybody has any other recording devices, turn them off too. Now you probably have noticed that we are selling some of the books over here to the side, and we're hoping that they will be signed afterwards if we have a moment or two. Catalina Gomez is our program coordinator, and she's the assistant curator of the Archive of Hispanic Literature at the Library of Congress. If you want to come on up. You want to go wait? She wants to come up later. All right, then she can do that. What I want to do now is introduce Tatiana de Germán Ribon, who's going to say a few words from the part of the embassy, who is also sponsoring the event. And we have tidbits in the back, which we like to call the propaganda de la casa, and also on the Poetry Center. And without further ado, I want to thank you again for all that have come. Thank you.
Thank you, Everett. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for this very special event with Juan Gabriel Vásquez and Anne McLean, not McLean. The Embassy of Colombia, as part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs' plan to promote Colombia abroad, is very pleased to be working together with the Library of Congress and the Inter-American Development Bank's Cultural Center to bring such a renowned author to read and converse with us about his award-winning book, The Sound of Things Falling. Colombia is a country well known for its literature. Many of you were probably assigned 100 Years of Solitude during high school by our Nobel Prize-winning author, Gabriel García Márquez, and learned about Latin American writers through their magical realism approach to literature. What Juan Gabriel presents for us today with The Sound of Things Falling is his own style of writing, one that differentiates itself from the magical realism movement by being a non-distorted reality. In The Sound of Things Falling, Juan Gabriel depicts the story of Antonio Llamara to remind us that our lives are defined by ourselves just as much as they are formed by external forces. He portrays a time in Colombia's history where no one was immutable to the violence that Colombia went through, even though you were not directly associated to it. Juan Gabriel has a law degree from la Universidad del Rosario in Colombia and a Ph.D. in literature from la Sorbonne in Paris. Today, he is well known for his creativity, but aside from writing novels, short stories, and essays, he is also a regular contributor to various magazines and journals, including a weekly opinion column for the newspaper El Espectador in Colombia. His books, which have been published in 17 languages, include The Informers, which was shortlisted for the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize, The Secret History of Costaguana, winner of the Quercy Prize in Barcelona, and The Sound of Things Falling, winner of the Alfaguara Prize in Spain, the English Pen Award in the UK, and the Gregor von Risori Prize in Italy. He is also the recipient of the Prix Roger Calois in 2012 for his compilation of novels, essays, and biography. His latest novel, Las Reputaciones, was published in Spanish in 2013, and given his success with The Sound of Things Falling, it would not surprise me that Amazon will shortly be advising you to read it as well. We also have Anne McLean with us here today. Anne, a Canadian translator of Spanish literature, has worked closely with Juan Gabriel for all three of his translated works, including The Sound of Things Falling. Something very interesting that I have learned about Anne is that she speaks 4 languages, but only started learning Spanish in her late 20s. This is startling, given that today she has become one of the most sought-out translators by Spanish and Latin American writers, and she has been awarded Independent Foreign Fiction Prize for her translations in 2004 and 2009. Once again, on behalf of the Colombian Embassy, I would like to thank all of you for joining us here today at the Library of Congress. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you all for coming and thank the people responsible for being here. Thank you, Library of Congress. Thank you, Inter-American Development Bank and the Embassy of Colombia. You have been very kind to me. This is the beginning of The Sound of Things Falling.
No, el ruido de las cosas al caer.
This is the beginning of El ruido de las cosas al caer. Anne McLean is not only my translator, she corrects me when I speak in public.
¿Te ayuda?
Gracias. El primero de los hipopótamos, un macho del color de las perlas negras y tonelada y media de peso, cayó muerto a mediados de 2009. Había escapado 2 años atrás del antiguo zoológico de Pablo Escobar en el Valle del Magdalena, y en ese tiempo de libertad había destruido cultivos, invadido abrevaderos, atemorizado a los pescadores y llegado a atacar a los sementales de una hacienda ganadera. Los francotiradores que lo alcanzaron le dispararon un tiro a la cabeza y otro al corazón, con balas de calibre .375, pues la piel de un hipopótamo es gruesa. Posaron con el cuerpo muerto, la gran mole oscura y rugosa, un meteorito recién caído. Y allí, frente a las primeras cámaras y los curiosos, debajo de una ceiba que los protegía del sol violento, explicaron que el peso del animal no iba a permitirles transportarlo entero, y de inmediato comenzaron a descuartizarlo. Yo estaba en mi apartamento de Bogotá, a unos 250 kilómetros al sur, cuando vi la imagen por primera vez, impresa a media página en una revista importante. Así supe que las vísceras habían sido enterradas en el mismo lugar en que cayó la bestia, y que la cabeza y las patas, en cambio, fueron a dar a un laboratorio de biología de mi ciudad. Supe también que el hipopótamo no había escapado solo. En el momento de la fuga, lo acompañaban su pareja y su cría, o los que en la versión sentimental de los periódicos menos escrupulosos eran su pareja y su cría, cuyo paradero se desconocía ahora, y cuya búsqueda tomó de inmediato un sabor de tragedia mediática, la persecución de unas criaturas inocentes por parte de un sistema desalmado. Y uno de esos días, mientras seguía la cacería a través de los periódicos, me descubrí recordando a un hombre que llevaba mucho tiempo sin ser parte de mis pensamientos, a pesar de que en una época nada me interesó tanto como el misterio de su vida. Durante las semanas que siguieron, el recuerdo de Ricardo Laverde pasó de ser un asunto casual, una de esas malas pasadas que nos juega la memoria, a convertirse en un fantasma fiel y dedicado, presente siempre, su figura de pie junto a mi cama en las horas de sueño, mirándome desde lejos en las de la vigilia. Los programas de radio de la mañana y los noticieros de la noche, las columnas de opinión que todo el mundo leía y los blogueros que no leía nadie, todos se preguntaban si era necesario matar a los hipopótamos extraviados, si no bastaba con acorralarlos, anestesiarlos, devolverlos al África. En mi apartamento, lejos del debate pero siguiéndolo con una mezcla de fascinación y repugnancia, yo pensaba cada vez con más concentración en Ricardo Laverde, en los días en que nos conocimos, en la brevedad de nuestra relación y la longevidad de sus consecuencias. En la prensa y en las pantallas, las autoridades hacían el inventario de las enfermedades que puede propagar un artiodáctilo y usaban esa palabra, artiodáctilo, nueva para mí. Y en los barrios ricos de Bogotá aparecían camisetas con la leyenda Save the Hippos. En mi apartamento, en largas noches de llovizna o caminando por la calle hacia el centro, yo comenzaba a recordar el día en que murió Ricardo Laverde, e incluso a empecinarme con la precisión de los detalles. Me sorprendió el poco esfuerzo que me costaba evocar esas palabras dichas, esas cosas vistas o escuchadas, esos dolores sufridos y ya superados. Me sorprendió también con qué presteza y dedicación nos entregamos al dañino ejercicio de la memoria, que a fin de cuentas nada trae de bueno y solo sirve para entorpecer nuestro normal funcionamiento, igual a esas bolsas de arena que los atletas se atan alrededor de las pantorrillas para entrenar. Poco a poco me fui dando cuenta, no sin algo de pasmo, de que la muerte de ese hipopótamo daba por terminado un episodio que en mi vida había comenzado tiempo atrás, más o menos como quien vuelve a su casa para cerrar una puerta que se ha quedado abierta por descuido. Y es así que se ha puesto en marcha este relato. No sé de qué nos sirva recordar, qué beneficios nos trae o qué posibles castigos, ni de qué manera puede cambiar lo vivido cuando lo recordamos. Pero recordar bien a Ricardo Laverde se ha convertido para mí en un asunto de urgencia. He leído en alguna parte que un hombre debe contar la historia de su vida a los 40 años y ese plazo perentorio se me viene encima. En el momento en que escribo estas líneas, apenas unas cuantas semanas me separan de ese aniversario ominoso. La historia de su vida. No, yo no contaré mi vida, sino apenas unos cuantos días que ocurrieron hace mucho, y lo haré además con plena conciencia de que esta historia, como se advierte en los cuentos infantiles, ya ha sucedido antes y volverá a suceder. Que me haya tocado a mí contarla es lo de menos. Gracias. Thank you very much.
In case there's anybody here who doesn't speak Spanish, the sound of things falling starts like this.
Louder.
Louder?
Yeah.
The first hippopotamus,
Yeah.
a male the color of black pearls, weighing 1.5 tons, was shot dead in the middle of 2009. He'd escaped 2 years before from Pablo Escobar's old zoo in the Magdalena Valley, and during that time of freedom had destroyed crops, invaded drinking troughs, terrified fishermen, and even attacked the breeding bulls at a cattle ranch. The marksman who finally caught up with him shot him once in the head and again in the heart with .375 caliber bullets, since hippopotamus skin is thick. They posed with the dead body, the great dark wrinkled mass, a recently fallen meteorite. And there, in front of the first cameras and onlookers, beneath a ceiba tree that protected them from the harsh sun, explained that the weight of the animal would prevent them from transporting him whole, and they immediately began carving him up. I was in my apartment in Bogota, 250 or so kilometers south, when I saw the image for the first time, printed across half a page of a national news magazine. That's how I learned that the entrails had been buried where the animal had fallen, and the head and legs had ended up in a biology lab in my city. I also learned that the hippopotamus had not escaped alone. At the time of his flight, he'd been accompanied by his mate and their baby, or what the sentimental version of the less scrupulous newspapers were, his mate and their baby, whose whereabouts were now unknown, and the search for whom immediately took on a flavor of media tragedy, the persecution of innocent creatures by a heartless system. And on one of those days, while following the hunt in the papers, I found myself remembering a man who'd been out of my thoughts for a long while, in spite of the fact that there had been a time when nothing interested me as much as the mystery of his life. During the weeks that followed, the memory of Ricardo Laverde went from being a minor coincidence, one of those dirty tricks our minds play on us, to becoming a faithful and devoted, ever-present ghost, standing by my bed while I slept, watching from afar in the daylight hours. On the morning radio programs and the evening news, in the opinion columns that everybody read, and on the blogs that nobody read, everyone was asking if it was necessary to kill the lost hippos, if they couldn't round them up, anesthetize them, and send them back to Africa. In my apartment, far from the debate, but following it with a mixture of fascination and repugnance, I was thinking more and more intensely about Ricardo Laverde, about the days when we'd known each other, about the brevity of our acquaintance and the longevity of its consequences. While in the press and on the TV screens, the authorities listed the diseases that could be spread by an arteriodactyl, and they used that word, arteriodactyl, new to me. And in the rich neighborhoods of Bogota, people wore t-shirts saying, "Save the hippos." In my apartment, on long, drizzly nights, or walking down the street toward the city center, I began to think stubbornly about the day Ricardo Laverde died, and even to force myself to remember the precise details. I was surprised by how little effort it took me to summon up the words I had spoken or heard, things I'd seen, pain I'd suffered and now overcome. I was also surprised by the alacrity and dedication we devote to the damaging exercise of remembering, which, after all, brings nothing good and serves only to hinder our normal functioning, like those bags of sand athletes tie around their calves for training. Bit by bit, I began to notice, not without some astonishment, that the death of that hippopotamus put an end to an episode of my life that had begun quite a while ago, more or less like someone coming back home to close a door carelessly left open. And that's how this story got underway. I don't know what good it does to us to remember, what benefits or possible penalties it brings, or how what we've lived through can change when we remember it. But remembering Ricardo Laverde well has become an urgent matter for me. I read somewhere that a man should tell the story of his life at the age of 40, and this deadline is fast approaching. As I write these lines, only a few short weeks remain before this ominous birthday arrives. The story of his life. No, I won't tell my life story, just a few days of it that happened a long time ago, and I'll do so fully aware that this story, as they warn in fairy tales, has happened before and will happen again. That I'm the one who's ended up telling it is almost beside the point.
Muy bien.
Well, thank you all for being here so much. And Anne and Juan Gabriel is such an incredible excitement for us to have you here. We've been wanting to get Juan Gabriel for some time now here at the library. And as Anne knows, because there's something that we discussed with Anne when she was here with another, a wonderful author from Spain. So we're going to have just a little conversation, mostly about The Sound of Things Falling, which is the book that we're here to celebrate. But hopefully we'll be able to cover a little bit about Juan Gabriel's craft as a writer and Anne's craft as a translator. So we're going to start with some questions about the novel. So in The Sound of Things Falling,
the history of the drug years in Colombia is given to us through characters whose lives are deeply impacted by this history. Their lives are completely altered by sort of their involvement with this world, just by touching this world of the drug trafficking world, but also through characters whose lives are altered much later in more indirect yet still very significant ways. Can you talk a little bit about this kind of ripple effect of history that's in your work, and how do you think it relates to Colombia specifically?
Yeah. Yes. Well, I don't know if I need the microphone. Well, one of the things, I started writing the novel in 2008, not knowing that I was beginning a novel in which I would discuss the effects that the years of the drug trade had on people not related to the drug trade. I started writing about this pilot called Ricardo Laverde, who in his younger years had been one of the first to smuggle drugs, to smuggle marijuana into the United States. This was in the early 70s. And I wrote about 100 or 120 pages about this guy, trying to figure out in fiction who he was, what his story was. And at some point of that process, I lost interest. It became too remote from me. I began wondering, why do I have to tell this story? Why is it urgent that I tell this story? And this sense of urgency is something I cannot work without. So I stopped writing the novel, and I thought I had lost all that work, all those pages written, when I opened this magazine and I saw the image of the dead hippo, in exactly the same way as my poor narrator does. That image of the hippo that had escaped from Pablo Escobar's zoo, who had been hunted down and killed by the Colombian army, it opened a window in a way. It made me, for the first time in many, many years, it made me remember what it was like to live through those years. For someone my age, someone who was born and who lived as a child in a peaceful world, and then had the whole country being violently changed. So I began thinking about all those things for the first time. I remembered my own visit to Pablo Escobar's zoo, which was a touristic destination and a very popular touristic destination for children. Of course, this was a place in which we could see animals that were very difficult to see if you didn't have the chance to leave Colombia. We had Pablo Escobar Zoo had not only these hippos, it had a kangaroo who was very good at shooting penalties to Colombian goalkeepers, who used to go to Pablo Escobar's property to get beaten by the kangaroo. Obviously, if they stopped the shot, they might get shot in another way. No, that's just a bad joke.
Very bad.
Yeah. Yeah, the rhinos, the pink dolphins, a parrot who could say the whole lineup for the Colombian national team, for instance. So it was a mythical place, and at the same time, the metaphor of the most dangerous and horrible things to have happened to my country in many, many years. And I realized, when I began thinking about that, I realized that the public story of the drug years had been told many, many times. And I realized that all kinds of information were available from the public point of view, let's say. So you could go on the internet and find all about the statistics of those years. How many cops Pablo Escobar killed every year? How many bombings he was responsible for? You can go on the internet and look at the photographs of the buildings his bombings destroyed. There's a photograph of the debris of this commercial airline plane that was bombed by Escobar in 1989. I don't know, you can even find the killing, the murder of a presidential candidate in 1989, Luis Carlos Galán. The video of his murder is there on YouTube. So the public side of this was not only quite well known, but there was almost too much information. Mm-hmm. Whereas there was no place where you could go to find out about the moral consequences, the emotional consequences of those years for the private individual. Because this is something that only fiction does. Right. You know, only fiction can trace the minute changes in somebody's psyche, the emotional and moral ways in which living through these experiences will change somebody. And the novel became that. The novel became that place where I could think about what happened to me, to the people of my generation, to a guy like Antonio Yamara, my narrator, who belongs to my generation, although he suffered much more than I did because of what happened in those years. That's the ripple effect, the idea that somebody who has absolutely no contact, no direct contact with the drug trade did in fact suffer its consequences. The idea of collateral damage became very, very pertinent for us during those years. And that's what the novel tries to tell.
And this kind of relates to the past question. So the novel's characters are in varied ways all deeply affected by the history, but usually your main character has to go through a process of discovering, of finding out this information. He feels the impact, but he doesn't know what it looks like or what it is exactly. I think that I perceive this in The Informers as well, the sort of a detective work. Is that something that comes just automatically, or is something that you do it consciously?
Yeah. Yes, this is true. My novels are built like investigations, like personal investigations of somebody else's life, of a certain mystery, but basically they're not interested in the mystery in itself, but in the mystery behind somebody else's life. I think it's a literary strategy that I like because, in a way, it imitates my own outlook on life. I function like that in my daily life, through curiosity for the lives of others, through this kind of fascination for the secrets everybody hides, for the complexity and the mystery in everybody else's lives. Mm-hmm. So my narrators tend to imitate that. They write not from the absolute knowledge of what the other one is, but through the gradual discovery of somebody else's life, right? The fascination, the curiosity, or the obsession about somebody else. This is what moves my narrators. This is why the books are built as really private quests, mm-hmm. right? Inquisitions into somebody else's secrets and mysteries and lies and or half-truths, which is something we all share. Right. The Informers is built like that. The Secret History of Costaguana is kind of a distortion of that idea, but it still is the fascination the narrator feels for the figure of Joseph Conrad, the great novelist who might have visited Colombia in the 19th century. And this is what this speculation is what the novel is built around. And in The Sound of Things Falling, well, it's this idea the narrator has that finding out the truth about somebody else's life will lead to some illumination about his own life. What happens in The Sound of Things Falling is that Antonio Yamara, my narrator, meets this pilot I was talking about, Ricardo Laverde, and a few pages into the novel, Ricardo Laverde is shot and the narrator, Antonio, is wounded, and his life changes dramatically. And the rest of the novel is his attempt at finding out who this character was, who Ricardo Laverde was, because he believes if he understands why the other one was killed, he may understand what happened to us, to him, what happened to him, what happened to his life, and maybe to life in his country as a consequence of that murder.
Okay, one more question for Juan Gabriel, and then we're moving on to Anne. So the book focuses mostly, well, not mostly, focuses on one part on the Colombians who were seduced to become involved with drug trafficking. This very seducing idea of the amount of money that could be made with becoming involved. But you also incorporate stories of foreigners. For example, there are some characters who are Peace Corps volunteers during those years in Colombia who also are involved. Their lives are affected as well. So can you talk about the decision of including Americans or people that were not from Colombia?
Yeah. Yes, well, I think one of the reasons we write novels is to be able to find the books we wanted to read and haven't been written. I wanted to read a book about the involvement of some American Peace Corps volunteers in the birth of the drug trade, but that book has not been written. I wanted to know what it feels like to be a part of the birth of that business that started out as a basic smuggling business and became one of the most violent and dangerous industries in the world, responsible for destabilizing whole countries, right? And I began to realize that this aspect of those years was something everybody talked about, but nobody wrote about. And this is pretty annoying for somebody who wants to understand those years. It is possible that the drug business was born the day Richard Nixon said for the first time the words "war on drugs." This was 1971. In 1969, he had closed the American border with Mexico so that Mexican marijuana wouldn't enter the United States. And obviously, marijuana consumers didn't stop consuming. They looked to other places where they could get the product. First Jamaica, then Colombia. At that moment, many countries who were part of the great program of the Peace Corps invented by President Kennedy were part of the countercultural movements. People who had lived who had lived through the countercultural movements, and who just were there at the right time for them, at the right time and the right place, and began serving as the first liaisons between Colombian producers and American consumers. So this situation seemed just fascinating to me, and worth understanding, worth getting to the bottom of.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
You will
Is it-
eventually ask a question?
No, I want to ask you a question about
Okay,
what
ask
you're
me a
saying
question.
now.
Okay.
Was that common knowledge in Colombia that the Peace Corps were involved in the drug trade?
Yeah.
Because I'd never heard about it till I read your book.
Yeah, it was common knowledge in some parts. In other parts, it was an urban legend. But the fact is mentioned as a footnote, literally. It is metaphorically a footnote in Colombian history, but literally I found it as a footnote in several academic papers about the birth of the drug trade. And it just seemed amazing that nobody had explored what it felt like to be a young American in search of new experiences, playing this role in a little business that nobody could even think that it would become the industry of corruption and violence that it became later. And I think this is what's great about the novel as a genre. E.L. Doctorow, the great novelist E.L. Doctorow, one of my favorite American writers, once told me that a novelist who writes about history is essentially somebody who pretends that there are documents that don't exist in reality, so that he can write about them. You know, a historian can only write about the documents he finds. A novelist can pretend that he finds other documents and then he writes on those false findings. Novels allow us to imagine things and to understand situations that are off limits for historians, such as this case. And that I think is why they enrich our idea of history, of what happened. And I think that's in many senses why we keep reading novels. They take us to places that have been unexplored by historians, maybe because they don't have the witnesses or the documents or whatever. Novels don't need that to deal with things that actually happened but that nobody wants to talk about.
Right.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to some questions about the translation process of this novel. So, Anne, you have translated a wide variety of prominent Hispanic writers. To name a few, Julio Cortázar, Enrique Villamatas, Javier Cercas, and Evelio Rosero, also from Colombia. What did you find that was particular about translating Juan Gabriel's work?
Besides the fact that I pester you all the time.
I think I pester you more than you pester me. But what's particular about your work? When I first read Los Informantes, which is the first book I translated, and long before I translated it, ¿Así? Is that better? Yep. Sorry. When I first read Los Informantes, I had been translating quite a few Iberian Spanish books, and I sort of, having never lived in Colombia or been in Colombia as a Spanish speaker, I somehow felt like his prose it felt really like coming home but just to Latin American Spanish, I suppose. And when I actually started translating it, I found it was much less comfortable than I thought it was. When I read it, I thought, yes, this is the author I was born to translate. And then I started translating it, and I went, wow, this is so Colombian. I don't know any of these words.
I wish I hadn't found about this author.
No, I did know most of the words. But I don't know I think what attracted me to it is what he was talking about before, is the style, the ideas, and the search, the quest, the way he draws his readers into the narrative. I mean, as his translator, I'm even more drawn into it but even before I knew I would be translating it, the first time I read it, I felt involved in the novel, even though I knew nothing about the history of German immigration in Bogota or any of all the things that I've learned about from his novels. But translating is a very intuitive process, so I can't really articulate what it is that makes it particular.
I mean, when you're translating the other authors as opposed to Juan Gabriel, is it the same process? It's just kind of you have to gear up the same way, or does it vary? Again?
Yeah, it varies. I translate the same no matter who I'm translating, but I sort of hear the characters in my head. I sort of have an ongoing dialogue with the characters. It's much more to do with the narrative voice than with the author. It's not the author who we translate. It's the text, and I have the benefit of knowing quite a few of my authors, but they're not who I'm translating. It's their characters and their narrative.
Right. Juan Gabriel, you've also been a translator. So, you being a translator, how was the process of translating your novels? You also having had the experience of translating yourself.
Yeah.
And that could be a question for both of you.
Yeah. Well, yes, I earned a living as a translator for many, many years. But the difference perhaps is the fact that my authors had been quite selfish in that they had died many, many years before I translated them. I translated works by Victor Hugo from the French, E.M. Forster from the English, John Hersey. I had the great pleasure of translating Hiroshima for the first time in Spain, not in Spanish. There was an Argentinian translation in the 60s, but in Spain it had never been translated. That was one of my first translations. But these guys were dead, and I could not reach them to ask questions. But I think those years made me understand that how pertinent is to the whole process that exchange between the translator and the author who's being translated. So when I began receiving emails from Anne McLean, which summed up to maybe 200 or 300 questions for the informers, as many questions as pages. I tried to be very helpful. I tried to not follow my instincts and answer the questions she was asking. And I think we began this collaborative relationship that has lasted 3 books and has become very interesting because since I can read and understand her translations, I can have a say in them, and I give her complete freedom to change anything she likes, because the most important thing for me is the way the words sound. And there are many instances in which the most immediate, let's say, translation of a sentence makes it sound not as good as it could with some other version or some other words. So Anne McLean knows she can do that. She can change things if it is for the benefit of euphony. It gives me also a chance to regret having written some things. And so, for instance, in The Secret History of Costaguana, there are a couple of paragraphs in the novel, in the original novel, that are no longer there in the English translation, because after long discussions we realized that they were just silly paragraphs and I should never have written them. So the effort, the collaborative effort, becomes very, very interesting, and I think I'm very lucky. I always say this when Anne is not here, so I might as well say it when she's here. I'm very lucky because I'm a writer that who changes with every book. I think there are two kinds of writers: those who find a voice and then stay there for the rest of their lives, and many writers I deeply admire belong to this group. Javier Marías in Spanish, or Thomas Bernhard in German. These are writers whose books could be put against each other and read as just one big novel. And then there are other writers, such as Edel Doctorow, or maybe Philip Roth, or Orhan Pamuk, the Turkish Nobel Prize, or Julio Cortázar, who change with every book, whose books are all different between themselves. And I think I sort of belong to this family. All of my books are different from each other. And that puts a very big challenge for the translator, who has to be able to do many different voices and have them sound as similar as possible to the original voice of the novel. And she's able to do that. And that's amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
But it also makes it more interesting, because I get to play different roles and take on new parts with every novel that he writes. And I'm sure Margaret Jewel Costa thinks it's very interesting to translate Javier Marías, even though he has the same voice in every novel. But I find it more interesting to translate writers who are stretching themselves and trying to do new things with every book. There was something else I was going to say. I've forgotten.
Maybe we'll come back.
Yeah. He is a very generous author. He does help me change. I don't actually take liberties and change like the setting or the characters' names or anything. But he does understand that translation is not a word-for-word transposition, and it is a literary creative act as well.
And do you seek to retain sort of the regional variations of the language? For example, in Juan Gabriel's work, the Spanish is usually from Bogotá, and the way that we speak in our daily lives, it's very obvious. Is it something that you can retain in translation?
You can retain a flavor of it. You can't, if my readers don't know what Bogotá Spanish sounds like in comparison to Medellin Spanish, he usually has a character go to Medellin and then the accents change. And so the North American or British readers aren't going to recognize that in the same way. But you make some sort of adjustment so that the people are speaking in a different way. And you can't tell, it's not as specific, the knowledge you're going to get, but the style and the tone is going to change in some way. It's subtle and hard to explain, but it's not as specific, but I think it does carry through somehow.
Okay, and this one's again for Juan Gabriel. You have lived outside of Colombia for many years. Do you feel like this distance from Colombia has shaped your writing in some way, and have the places where you lived in London, Brussels, I think Barcelona,
Paris.
Oh, not Brussels,
Not London.
not London. Okay, I'm sorry. So Brussels, Barcelona,
Paris.
and Paris. Do you feel like these places have shaped the way you write, or affected?
Yes, I think so. And one of the strongest effects they have had on my writing is the fact that I have been able to write about Colombia, which is something that gave me a really hard time. When I left when I was 23, and I left for Paris. I was this walking cliche of a Latin American writer leaving for Paris to write about my own country, which is what everybody did. Garcia Marquez, Vargas Llosa, Julio Cortázar, Carlos Fuentes, they all left their countries for Paris. And that generation, the generation of the Latin American boom, is a generation of people, it's a generation of great novels about Latin American countries written always from elsewhere. The great Colombian novel of the 20th century was written in Mexico. The great Mexican novel was written in Washington and London. The great Peruvian novel was written in Paris. Even the great Paraguayan novel, Yo el Supremo, by Augusto Roa Bastos, was written in Buenos Aires. So, you know, we have to leave in order to understand our country, but also maybe in order to learn how to write about it. What happened to me was that when I left Colombia, being very young, I was 23, I really felt I didn't understand my country. I felt I didn't understand it, I didn't know it in a way, and I had grown up in this kind of Flaubertian or Hemingwayan ethics, meaning that you can only write about what you know. You know, if you're going to write about the Civil War, well, then you must go and fight the Civil War and then come back and write about it, which is what Hemingway thought. And I thought that if I didn't feel I understood my country, then I had no moral right, in a way, to write about it. And I've always said it was only the distance, the distance both geographical and chronological, that made me realize something very important, something that really changed my life. And that is that not understanding something is the best reason to write about it. That fiction is a way of knowing things, that fiction is a way of understanding things you didn't understand before. It's a way of shedding some light into dark corners of our experience, our personal experience, but also our social experience, that thing we call history. The fact that I didn't understand these things was the best justification to treat them in fiction, which is nothing new. I mean, I call it the Joseph Conrad method, which is basically dealing with the world as if the world was a dark place, and fiction was this tool, this lamp, this tool for going into those dark places, trying to figure out what happens there, and then coming back to tell about it. And that was only possible because of the distance, because I had left Colombia, because I had looked at Colombian history from a distance, and also because in Paris, in Belgium, in Spain, through my contact with the English language, I had discovered the writers that would allow me to learn this, to understand that this was possible.
Okay, going back to the novel and to the hippopotamus. I found the hippo, it was such a strong image in the novel. Well, you start with the hippo, and I feel like like one of the most climactic scenes is when Elaine is staring at another hippo in the zoo, at the zoo. That's a really strong moment. You described earlier that when you saw the image of the hippo in the magazine, that kind of just really inspired you to keep to write a story. But did the hippo become sort of a symbol of something, or is it not a symbol? I don't know.
Yeah. I think the great thing when you write literature is that when you fall in love with an image, it almost always becomes a symbol of something that you didn't intend it to become. When I found the photograph of the hippo, I knew immediately that my narrator, or rather the novel, would begin in the same way as it took shape for me, with the finding of this photograph. And I became fascinated with it, fascinated with the image of this huge beast just lying down, dead, surrounded by the hunters. And when the novel was published, I began wondering aloud, why the fascination with this image? And somebody pointed out that the image strongly resembled the photograph that began circulating in Colombia of Pablo Escobar hunted down by the drug agents and the military, and the Colombian military. He was shot on the rooftops of Medellin, and the image, the most famous picture of that moment was the image of the dead body of Pablo Escobar lying down surrounded by his hunters. And that just made a very strong impression on me. And I realized that up to what point fiction works on a subconscious level in that sense.
Right.
It wasn't just the image of a beautiful dead animal, but that parallel between the two groups of hunters and the two dead bodies. That just made a very strong impression on me.
And there were also kind of two generations of hippos, because one hippo is Ricardo Laverde seeing
Yes.
it, and then the other one is Alberto, and so I thought that was also really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're running out of time, but I want to ask just one last question, which was one of my favorite questions that I had. The book seems to suggest that we should remember the past, even if it means dealing with painful and ugly truths, personal and national truths. Why do you think it's important to remember painful times, and do you feel that that can be possible without the past defining the present moment or the future?
Well, yes, the idea of memory, the idea of remembering uncomfortable pasts is one of my few obsessions as a novelist. But it is just because I think that this is one of the great things literature does. Literature has always played this role of a place when we can avoid or we can prevent some things from being forgotten. I always go back to 1984, George Orwell's novel, in which there is a hole called the memory hole, which is where the dictatorship, the totalitarian regime, throws all the uncomfortable documents that talk about an uncomfortable past, or the past that Big Brother doesn't want us to know about. So the memory hole is actually the forgetting hole. And I think there are very strong and very powerful forces at work right now in the world trying to make us forget that some things happened. We all remember, if we have read a little bit about them, about Stalinism, we all remember how Stalin managed to erase Trotsky from the photographs of encyclopedias and documents. I recently went to Mexico, to the house where Trotsky died. There's a photograph there in which Trotsky is standing next to some other big name in the Communist Party, waiting for their turn to speak in public. Somebody else is speaking on the microphone. That image was manipulated by the Stalin regime to eliminate Trotsky. And when I visited his house in Mexico, the photograph was surrounded by Russian students who were there because that was the only place in the world where they could look at the actual photograph. This is literature in many cases. Literature is that place where things are discussed that are not discussed in any other place because powerful people don't want them to be discussed. or want them to be forgotten. In one of the books by Primo Levi, Los Hundidos y los Salvados is the Spanish title.
The Drowned and the Saved.
The Drowned and the Saved. Literal translation by Anne McLean. There's a short prologue by Primo Levi in which he remembers a story that Simon Wiesenthal used to tell. He used to tell that the Nazi guards at his concentration camp used to come up to him, to Simon Wiesenthal, and say, "It doesn't matter how the war ends. Our war against you, we have already won, because nobody will believe you when you tell these stories. Nobody will believe the existence of concentration camps or gas ovens or whatever. We will destroy all the proofs and nobody will believe you. The reason we now know that happened is that there were writers among those prisoners. Simon Wiesenthal, Primo Levi, Jacques Améry, Victor Klemperer. They were people who took the business of memory seriously. That's maybe the most extreme example of this situation in the 20th century, but in many ways, this is also one of the things I try to do with my novels, try to prevent people from forgetting that these things happened in these ways. And that, as Carlos Fuentes used to say, there's no living future with a dead past. We have to know the past, we have to remember the past in order to move forward.
Good answer.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. We're going to open up for questions from the audience.
Master Juan Gabriel, it's an honor to have you here in DC. I wanted to ask you about Joseph Conrad in all your works. I had the opportunity to read the biography you wrote about him a long time ago. And it seems that you have, you look at him some sort of an influence or somebody that you want to recall in all your works. How is Joseph Conrad present in El Ruido de las Cosas al Caer?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Yes, Joseph Conrad is maybe the single most important discovery I've made as a novelist. I think there are two kinds of influences for a novelist. One is the influence a writer has on your technique or style or craftsmanship, and the other one is the influence they have on your outlook, on your literary outlook, the reasons we write novels, the reasons we read novels, the way you deal with the world as a writer. And Conrad has shaped both aspects of my work, I think. The idea of dealing with the world as this area of darkness, and that fiction is able to illuminate that darkness, has been as important for me as the way he builds his novels, which are always built around different voices. Conrad is somebody who believes, whose narrators are always discovering somebody else who speaks, somebody else who tells their story. And that also is a way in which this fascination with the lives of others becomes apparent. In the Sound of Things Falling, I think his influence is less evident than in other books, but it is. There were a couple of books that I had in my mind when I was writing this one. One was Under Western Eyes, one of the best novels Joseph Conrad ever wrote, to my mind, which is the novel of a narrator, the story of a narrator writing about somebody else in order to tell a story without noticing that telling that story will make them understand themselves much better, which is also Heart of Darkness. You know, the narrator, Marlowe, writing the story of Kurtz, begins understanding himself, understanding what has happened to him much, much better. I think that's mainly it. Somebody pointed out to me this morning that in The Sound of Things Falling, the narrator mentions, alludes to Conrad at some moments, a moment in which the narrator says that when his first child was being born and he was getting married, he was crossing this line, this shadow line, which is the title of one of Joseph Conrad's great stories about the coming of age of a man, about the maturity of a man. So it seems Antonio Llamara has also read Joseph Conrad, which makes me really very proud. Yeah. Thank you.
Any more questions?
I'd like to know more about the informer. I don't see it
Sorry,
here.
sorry, just, can you wait?
Oh,
Sorry, thank you.
yes, I'd like to know more about the informer. I don't see the book here. Where can I buy it? It's here.
Oh, it is here.
It is?
Here? Oh, okay.
It is? Oh,
So,
great.
Was this written in Spanish
Yes,
originally?
yes.
And it has been translated into 7 languages?
17.
By Anne.
Oh, 17.
Yes,
Okay.
which,
So, the title is very enlightening. Informer. Is it about really an informer, or is it just a...
there are more than one informers in the book. It's called The Informers because it deals with a very strange, really, episode in Colombian history when, during the 1940s, the Colombian government set this sort of confinement camps, sort of prison camps, for what were called enemy citizens. At the time, Colombia had allied itself with the United States in the effort of the Second World War. So, since in Colombia there was actually a Nazi party, clandestine and non-official, non-recognized, but still, and they were Nazi spies and they were fascist sympathizers, the government created these camps for enemy citizens to be imprisoned. Now, Colombian history being what it is, the government ended up, through certain misunderstandings, persecuting all things German. For instance, not only Nazi sympathizers, but also people who were completely innocent but who spoke German or who went to the German schools, and even Jewish escapees who had a German passport, and the Colombian authorities in many rural areas were not able to distinguish between a Nazi sympathizer and a Jewish with a German passport. So in 1999, I met a woman who told me, a Jewish woman who had arrived in Colombia in 1934, I think, or 36, who told me that her father, who was obviously a Jewish escapee, had almost been thrown into this prison because he had a German passport. And that was the beginning of my interest in that anecdote, in the world of German immigrants in Colombia in the 1940s. And the novel is the story of a journalist in the 1980s who begins discovering the very strange role his father played in this whole situation. So that's what the novel is about. Yes.
Where can I get it in Spanish? Because it was originally written.
Yes, it
Where
was.
can I get it in Spanish?
I have
Amazon?
in Amazon. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
perfect.
I was going to say I have no idea, but obviously Amazon is the place.
Los informantes.
I was late coming here, so this question was asked by Catalina earlier. I'm sorry. Okay, so I was not able to get here early, so if you already asked this, I apologize. But you just mentioned how much you like history and memory. Yet one of the most brilliant things you do in La Historia Secreta de Costa Juana is that you mess with the reader because you put history in anachronistic moments. I mean, there's a character that at some point says, La historia no solverá, which is obviously not something that they could have known because it's from 20th century, from Castro. So I was just wondering how you come to this moment in which you, in your pursuit of talking about history, decide to play with your readers with their knowledge of history, because I found myself wondering. I mean, this makes sense, but what?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did everybody hear the question?
Sorry,
No?
that's fine. All right, well, that was very good. Is this working better?
Yes.
Okay, well.
Just
So an abbreviated version is how you come to the decision to play with your readers by how you intermix history in a novel that's very much about history itself. And
Yeah.
because I know you like the memory and the idea of history.
Yeah, yeah. Yes. In The Secret History of Costaguana, the main subject of the book is the concept of history itself. It's a very playful book and full of adventures and humor and all that, but its main subject is how history gets written. The idea that history is something that somebody told us, whether it is a book or a teacher, it is the work of a narrator. History is not born out of itself. It's not created spontaneously. It's a tale told by somebody. And since it is that, we must assume its narrator had a certain political agenda, had the intention of suppressing some facts or highlighting others. And this reflection is very much at the core of the novel. And the way I decided to think about this idea, to reflect about this idea in the novel, was the playful way, to deliberately distort history so that the reader would be constantly forced to contemplate the fact that I am writing about history, but that I am distorting it, that I am not being completely truthful. In some instances in the novel, this is not the only objective of this strategy. There's a Colombian president who negotiated the Treaty of the Panama Canal, through which Colombia, let's say, lost control of the construction of the Panama Canal. This leading in many ways to the independence of Panama in 1904. Well, in my novel, this guy dies almost immediately after negotiating the treaty, because in my novel, the treaty is this big, bad curse that makes everybody die. In reality, the president didn't die after negotiation of the treaty. He lived 20 more years and he died in Rome. A descendant of this president came up to me once and said, "Why did you kill my grandfather so early?" You know, I thought I was going to get into a lot of trouble, but I tried to explain, and eventually I didn't get into trouble. I tried to explain that there is something that fiction can do that history cannot, and it is look for poetical truths. The fact that he dies after negotiation of the treaty serves to establish a poetical point, not a literal point, but a poetical truth, the idea of what this moment meant for Colombia, right? And the novel does that, the same thing in many other instances. You pointed out one of them. But also the narrator who tells the story from the year 1924 is always complaining that he hates those books where everything is magical, where beautiful women rise into the skies and people come back from the dead, which is obviously 100 years of solitude. That's playful, but that's also a commentary about the very tense relationship we Colombian readers have with the works of Gabriel García Márquez. So these are indirect ways fictions have with dealing with their materials, and they always point to some poetical truth that respect for the facts of history may miss. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We run out of time, so please join me in thanking Juan Gabriel and Anne McLean.
Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.